Monkeyboy's channel is intersubjectively and stands independently the greatest channel of all time.
What's the evidence? He asks me a question. That's a question. Yeah, but he needs an answer. Wow, great one. Hey, do you have evidence that a God exists?
Yeah, that if morals are absolute, requires
what does it mean for morals to be absolute?
Universal and unchanging.
Universal and unchanging. And by morals, you mean what? Like concepts like good and bad?
Yeah, prescribed behavior.
Yeah, so the fact actions are good and bad universally. Well, do you think it's universally wrong to lie?
Well, there'd be like more nuance, I guess, with the context, but
what is something that what's an example of something you think is universally wrong?
Like smurder.
Okay, if I either schmurder one person, or let me ask you,
because murder is
that's trivially unjustified. I took that to be just you mean unaliving someone. Yeah, so unaliving someone, that's always wrong. But what happened if imagine I had a world in which I either unalived one person, or for the rest of the time all organisms are tortured indefinitely to the maximum pain level. Do you think it's wrong contrastively that I unalive? Because I'm morally culpable. I'm culpable if I'm aware of the entailment of not unaliving and me and all of the rest of organisms.
Look, he's making a claim that he could say that we could grant that there are absolute and
I know.
universal.
I guess I don't even understand. I don't even understand what is the thing God is explaining there.
Yeah.
The fact that there's things that are wrong, and by wrong, what do you mean there?
Well, I mean, the thing is, we probably could challenge him about what it means to have reasons to do X that are independent aims and desires.
I guess. Well, I want to do
but
this.
The thing is,
I want to understand what he's
attempting
to explain.
Yeah, we could grant that and just sort of ask, well, let's say morals are absolute and universal. What was the third word he said? Unchanging. Let's say they're absolute, universal, unchanging, whatever. Why would that show that God exists?
Because it's prescribed behavior. Therefore, it requires evaluation, which is conceptual. It requires a mind.
Wait, hold on. You said.
Well, I think that people are just going to. I think people.
If it's an ought claim, it means
let me break that down. There's prescriptive facts. How from prescriptive facts do we get to God?
Because if something is prescriptive, then it's prescribed.
He's saying that prescription is an agential concept. That's what he's trying to say.
Well,
I think most people are just not going to grant that, right? That when they say that something
I don't think. No, I think the better way to go down this is he wants to explain the fact things are absolutely unchanging, universally right and wrong. And by what does it mean for something to be right and wrong?
No, now he's changed his claim, right? Because his point is that it's not actually the fact that they're absolute, universal, and unchanging that demonstrates that a deity exists, but the fact that they're prescriptions. So basically, he's saying.
But that's fine. Look, I want to understand what you mean by good and bad there. Because, look, he's either going to mean something tethered to God, or there's just going to be the open question of, well, suppose I do grant those things exist. Why think God explains them? So what do you mean by right and wrong?
How you ought to be.
He's saying that they're prescriptions.
Yeah.
Right.
What does it mean for? Wait. But what does it mean? I'm asking. Like, I'm trying to walk him down the meta-ethical stuff. Like, what do you mean? What I ought do? What does it mean for? What makes something? In virtue of what ought I do something?
I don't know.
What does it mean for me? When you say I ought do X,
but he can just give the standard answer that they give, right? Which is just in virtue of it being good, right? And that's going to be some like irreducible, indefinable, unanalyzable emotion. Right? But point is, if you grant all that,
but Jack, do you understand what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to like investigate the meta ethics to see whether he has some concept just tethered to theism, to which I could just deny this God morality, right? Because it's just a commitment
to theism. Which he's tethering it to theism is by saying that. Because let's say...
but I mean like analytically tethered. Because he just might mean something like...
I think he is saying it's analytically tethered because he's saying... Well,
then it's not a bullet to bite that. Like imagine he said the attitude of God's, right? Like God's attitude. If that's what he meant by good, what God prefers I do.
Well, I guess there is a way to focus the question, right? So take a claim like one ought not destroy the life of another individual, or something like that. Now, that doesn't look like a prescription, right? So the question is, are you saying... Now, see, you're going to have to explain the analytic-synthetic distinction here, or I'll have to explain it, because if I ask...
I don't think we need to go down all of this, because I think it's just easiest we understand what he means. When you say something is good, and you say that it's something I ought to do, what does that mean?
Like something should be a certain way.
And what does it mean that something should be that
Yeah,
way?
but that seems like an unfair question because almost everybody's going to say that's unanalyzable.
And are you supposing that he's not going to understand the ethical inquiry and he's going to be incapable of answering?
I'm just saying that in metaethics, words like ought and should are generally, there's a general view that those are unanalyzable concepts.
Well, no, like if I'm a subjectivist or something, I would obviously say what I ought to do is what's in line with my preferences.
Well, I think what you're saying there is that, I'm not sure that that's offering analysis. That's actually just filling in what counts as what you want to do, right?
No,
And
That's not actually offering
how's
a
that any
definition.
different?
I'm
No,
not
that,
against morals.
but that is
based
the necessary and
as well.
sufficient conditions. Like the necessary and sufficient condition under which I ought to do something is when it corresponds to my preference at that given time.
But look, somebody can just say those are not what you ought to do, and they're not necessarily having a dispute over meaning, right? They're having a dispute over what counts as something, what the actual moral facts are.
Yeah, that might be true. Well, I mean, there's like, I don't know. I mean, if you don't think the way I'm doing this is like, if you rather do it your way, then I guess. I mean, I think my way is fine, but go ahead, Jack. You could talk with this guy then.
Well, look, if somebody says one ought not, remove somebody's life, take away somebody's life, all else equal, that doesn't actually look like a prescription, right?
Wait, sorry, I wasn't listening. What did you say? Were you asking me that or him?
No, I was asking him. Because, like, normally I take a prescription to be a command, right? Don't take away somebody's life, right? But, like, moral proposition, or moral statements, right, if they express propositions, probably most people are going to understand that to be something like, one ought not take away anybody's life, right? And that's not a command.
Wait, one not ought to? That is a command, though.
No. If I just say, well, look, grammatically, it doesn't have the form of a command.
No, it's not a command.
Right? The form of a command is don't take anybody's life.
Yeah.
Don't do it. But if I make a statement that one ought not to take away somebody's life, right? That doesn't have the form of a command. Now, you might want to say they're disguised commands. Some people do take that view, right? That they're disguised. Well, I guess divine command views.
But there's still like a normative demand that something.
Yeah, it's normative. It's a normative demand. I'll
Yeah.
grant you that. It's a normative demand. But I guess the
But the
question
latter
is
is
going to
a
be,
normative statement and not a demand.
well, I think the idea is just that there's a demand afforded on an agent in virtue of that proposition.
I mean, not the latter, the prior.
True. But I think the idea is going to be that a normative demand is afforded is afforded to an agent in virtue of the fact that the normative proposition is true. That's probably what he wants to say. Right? It generates a demand. Of course, plenty of people are going to say that demand should not be understood as presupposing an agent. So I'm not exactly sure how you would argue for that, because it sounds like you might just be begging the question against people who have a different view. Right? Either that, or you are changing the subject. You are sort of like saying there are these commands out there, right, which require an agent, require a universal, absolute, timeless, changeless agent to issue the commands, right? But that's not how most people are presumably are going to understand those statements, right? At least if they're not theists, right?
Yeah, but like it doesn't rest upon if it's a command or not. Like it could still be like one of the claims that you said, like do not do this, or it ought to be good that you don't schmurder, or you said something similar like that. But that's still a normative claim that something should
I'm
be
granting
in
it's a
certain
normative
way.
claim, right? What's at issue is how do you establish that a claim of that type should be understood, right, as a command?
Because it's a prescription. It's an obligation to be something in a certain way. So that
look. Some people are going to just deny that those statements express.
You understand propositions aren't commands, right? So to
Yeah,
utter a
he might say
proposition-
it's an indirect speech act, right? So look, you could say it's although it has the grammatical form of a statement, it in fact expresses a command, right, in an indirect way, right? But then it's not clear why somebody would have to accept that, right? But then even if they grant that this moral language actually should be understood prescriptively. Some people are just going to deny that what they understand a prescription to be presupposes an agent issuing the prescription. They're going to understand prescription in a way that's compatible with there being an agent.
Yeah, that's my argument.
But see, that's the thing that it's unclear how you could support, right? Like, I'm not saying that's a crazy view to have. I mean, I might actually think it's crazy, but I'm not saying that here, right? I'm willing to take seriously, for the sake of this discussion, that idea. The question is, how would you establish that?
And you kind of already says it. It presupposes an agent who gives...
Yeah, but that's the claim we're trying to get you to support, right? Because that's just an assertion, right? You're asserting that that's the way that these kinds of moral statements should be understood.
Yeah, we're not granting you it presupposes that.
But see, I think there's going to be a deeper problem because I kind of feel like...
Wait, so then what's the contrary then, if my
I
presupposition...
mean, what's the contrary?
So there's a number of different views people could take. One view would be to say, yes, these are indirect speech acts, they do express prescriptions, but prescriptions are not the kinds of things that presuppose a prescriber, right? That's one view. Another view is just to deny that, although the language is normative, right, that it should be understood prescriptively, right? Because that's a type of, they call that a type of non-cognitive.
Thanks for the heart, Josh.
Right? Because cognitivist views are ones that say that normative statements express propositions, right? Like, they're kind of similar to saying it's raining outside, right? It's wrong to take away anybody's life. It's raining outside, right? It's that type of a statement, right? Some people are going to say that.
Yeah, so what would the argument be for that?
The argument for that's the correct way to understand those statements.
But then I could just say this is...
He was just giving you alternatives.
Yeah,
Jack.
I was just sort of saying those are some things that people might say, right? Like, my own view is probably that there isn't some consistency in these kinds of statements, right? But I'm not sure why we would think that, right? I mean, I guess it's an empirical question, so maybe somebody who is actually engaged in empirical studies of how people use moral language could give a more, well, surely they could give a more informed answer, right? But it looks like there's like some diversity in the way people use moral language. Because when they're asked, what do you mean when you say something
Thanks for the
like
hard
this? Do you mean to utter something that's like a command? Do you mean to utter something that's like a statement? Do you mean to utter something that's like an expression of emotion, and so on? People are going to give different answers, right? Because I guess maybe you have potentially a serious argument in the sense that if it were true that moral language was something that should be understood as some type of indirectly expressed command.
Thanks for the galaxy, Zach.
And a command presupposes some authoritative agent. Maybe the only type of agency
Josh,
that could
that
be is a God. So maybe that would be a good argument for God. I'm not sure I have like a strong challenge to the reasoning there. Like, I think maybe the reasoning could be valid, right? The problem is that I think what we would be, I'm speaking on behalf of monkeyboy 2 here, perhaps, is that we would probably just reject the idea that there are authoritative commands of this kind.
Yeah.
And so you'd have to convince us that there are such things. Right?
Yeah.
Thanks for the heart, Zach.
Yeah, I guess that then makes sense. Like,
Nah, Josh, that does not count.
The first premise itself that morals are absolute. So then it would then just lead to like a relativist position.
Yeah.
By the way, I
think
don't think you believe in any of that, like the normative stuff about universal, unchanging morality. But in any case.
But yeah, I think you're actually a better guest than we usually get here, because
Zach.
you actually offered something that could be turned into an argument. I think what you said was not straightforwardly valid, but Steelman, I think probably there may well be a good valid argument there. I mean, a valid argument there. But the problem is, it's hard to see why we would accept the premises of that argument. So, but I think that's a good. I think you've got something.
Thanks for the good.
I think you've got something more than what we usually get here. Potentially something that.
To be honest, I don't know. I think you're giving him too much credit, to be honest.
Yeah, but look, the point is, he was asked, right? What's your evidence that God exists, right? And he said, because morality is absolute. Now, when questioned, it turned out that what really mattered, right, the way in which it really
Thanks for the discard, Zach.
is supposed to point to a God, right, or the evidence for the existence of God, is that prescriptions require a prescriber, right? And he's just asserting that
Okay, like-
these so-called moral absolutes are actually prescriptions, right?
Mhm.
And so I think if that were true, you might say that would establish that God exists. The problem is we don't really. It's not clear to us why we ought to accept any of the premises, but it's not that
Actually,
the
it doesn't
reasoning is
even
invalid.
establish. It actually wouldn't even get you to theism, I don't think. But
Well,
That's-
it would get you to an agent, right?
yeah, but the
So
question
you want to
of-
say
because it
you wanna
doesn't. I don't
say
see why
why
you think
would
that
that
the
agent?
agents.
Yeah, you want to say
supernatural.
right. You want to say why would that agent have to be a God? I guess that's worth exploring. So, like, if let's say we granted that an agent was required to issue moral prescriptions, how do you think you would argue that that agent would have to be a God?
Because if morals are absolute, it requires an unchanging universal mind, which is what moral absolutes are. And to ground them, it requires that mind.
Well, it doesn't follow the mind's unchanging, but
So do
but he
you-
prescribes unchanging.
Well, the idea is that he can't change his prescriptions, right?
Yeah, that might be true, but there's going to be other ways in which his mind can obviously change. Like, I mean, obviously his mind is in some trivial way changing, if like informed about the changes about the world, right?
Yeah.
I don't actually hold to that. I don't believe God's mind changes.
Well, do you think God acquires knowledge?
No, that would,
Wait, so you don't think relative to instant, like imagine John, the proposition John is walking his dog today. You
Yeah.
don't think God's mind, his belief about that proposition, that changes?
He might say
Yeah,
that God
he
is
has-
outside of time.
Yeah, so God doesn't really have propositional knowledge. He has knowledge of propositional
So then I
propositions, but his
suppose-
mode
So
of knowing is different.
you subscribe to some kind of divine simplicity.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah.
Are you
He's
a
pure.
Muslim?
No, Christian.
Oh, you're a Christian. Okay, so
Yeah.
what? Just are you a Thomist?
No,
Eastern
Orthodox.
Orthodox? Or
Yeah.
Oriental? You're Eastern Orthodox.
Oriental.
Oriental Orthodox. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Egyptian?
No, Malankara.
Malankara. Wow. Okay. You're from India. You're from like Goa, or around
Oh,
there,
yeah,
right?
South India. Yeah.
Yeah, St. Thomas. You're a St. Thomas Christian.
Yeah, St. Thomas Christian.
Wow. Okay. All right. All right. So you're Oriental Orthodox. You think that there's a. So you're part of the Syriac tradition,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you believe in some kind of absolute divine simplicity, and you think God is an atemporal being. Okay. Well, on that view, monkey boy. I mean, I don't know how to make sense of those types of views, but on that view, right?
Yeah, I don't think
putatively,
divine simplicity is
God's knowledge
intelligible.
doesn't change, right? God
Wait,
is
wait.
outside of time, and he's and he
I
doesn't.
mean, I guess I don't.
Yeah.
What
Wait,
does it
Jack,
even mean to say God has knowledge if he doesn't have beliefs?
Well, he doesn't have propositional knowledge.
the
So
What
mode
does
in
that
which
mean?
so the mode in which he knows things isn't like changing.
When you say
they
God knows something, what does that mean?
they probably mean that he has acquainted knowledge, right? Of propositions, of truths, facts. He has some kind of acquainted knowledge, right?
But also, Jack, with this argument, like I try to push
What?
it
That
towards-
doesn't make any sense. Like,
Well, I'm
acquainted
just
knowledge,
telling you.
like I know
I'm telling
John.
You, look, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense. I'm just telling you that's
That
one
sounds
thing.
so bad.
That's one thing. That's what Craig says. Craig says. You want to know what Craig says? I'm not saying this is this guy's view.
He also has
But
the. I didn't know Craig.
Craig,
believed in
here's what Craig
propositional knowledge.
says. Here's what Craig says. First of all, God does not have propositional knowledge. His knowledge is acquainted. And what God has acquainted knowledge of is one unbroken proposition that contains all propositions. So he has knowledge
Such a
of something
joke.
that's singular. Finite minds have to break that up. I think it's basically a Thomist idea. Interestingly, I think he gets this from Thomism.
That,
right?
that just. I did not mean to bring this.
I mean, yeah, we are in like we do believe God is purely actual. So
Does
there's no
Venus have
potency.
any objections to divine simplicity? I mean, I
I'm
don't
sure
think
he
he's
does. Is
intelligent.
Venus here? Venus, you
Yeah,
want to
he
talk to this guy
Yeah.
about divine simplicity?
I mean, sure.
Go ahead.
Well, what was the specifically about divine simplicity? Like,
Well,
what
we were
is-
talking. He was trying to argue. Let me give you the dialectic so far, right? This is sort of like a Steelman version of his dialectic. Something like, and we're granting it. We're granting him all kinds of premises that we would think are dubious, right, or false. So something like moral language is indirectly expresses commands. Commands require an agent, right? And that's like anybody, right? Commands require an agent, and that agent has to have some kind of. That agent's mind has to be absolute and unchanging, right, for it to fulfill the requirement of the dictates of
Divine simplicity.
morality, right? And so, given that his knowledge doesn't change as things change in the world, he has to posit a God that's outside of time. He's also positing that God doesn't even have propositional knowledge, right? Because that would require parthood. in God. So he's holding to some kind of absolute divine simplicity, right? So do you have something you would say to a view like that?
So let me just see if I'm tracking.
Yeah.
Moral talk requires commands.
Yeah.
Commands requires agency, which in turn requires a mind.
Yeah.
Okay, and from there, where did you move to?
Well,
divine simplicity and propositional stuff?
it's not the most straightforward inference, right? But it's going to be something in the ballpark of that the kind of command which would have authority is presumably going to be something like this, right? The kind of command that would have the requisite authority to fulfill this role of prescribing universal, absolute, commands would be a mind that is unchanging, absolute, something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And he thinks that such a mind would have to be timeless and absolutely simple, right? Meaning that he doesn't actually even have propositional knowledge, because that would require parkhood in God's mind, right? Let's just say that he gets there. Let's say that let's say if we granted all the premises that the reasoning is valid, and so he gets to an absolutely divine mind, right? An absolutely simple divine mind. What would you say in response to somebody who just said, "I think it's intelligible and coherent to hold that there is a God and he is absolutely simple"?
Okay, I think I understand the question. So we're granting here, for the sake of the argument, that like non-propositional knowledge and that stuff makes
I'm not sure.
makes sense.
No, I don't know that we are granting that. You might want to say, well, what does it even mean to say that? Right? I'm not sure what he could say, but just whichever line of inquiry you want to pursue.
Yeah, because I have like a hard time even understanding what that even means. It just seems like
I think
nonsense to me.
Not our guest, but yeah, I think we all find that hard to understand. Yeah.
So like at that point, I'm not sure. At least on this point, I would.
Well, here's an idea. Can you explain
on talk of like doxastic stuff?
Yeah. Well, can you explain why you have a hard time accepting that or understanding that? Maybe that would be helpful for him to understand what the issue seems to be.
Right. So I just take it that knowledge has like a warrant requirement or a justificatory requirement, depending on like whatever kind of like theory you have in mind, which is and such a requirement of warrant or justification is going to be alethetic somehow, tied to truth. And it is hard for me to understand how it could be tied to truth if it's not propositional. But propositional is going to entail intentional states, which is going to entail some kind of like non-simplicity, which then would like render absolute divine simplicity problematic. And so, given that knowledge is tied to truth in such a way, and truth in such a way entails propositions, and then you're saying it's not propositional, I have a hard time understanding how we're even talking about knowledge at that point. Did that make sense? Or?
Yeah, no, I do grant that God has knowledge of propositions, but his mode in knowing things isn't propositional.
You're saying that he does have proposition, but his mode is not propositional?
In his mode of knowing things is propositional.
Right, so what is the mode there? What does that mean? His mode of knowing?
Like his way of knowing things about the world or about stuff.
Okay, his knowledge is proposition. Because I just take it that when you say his knowledge is propositional, the way that I understand that is just to say that he has intentional states whose content is, true, warranted, and the first condition is just to say that he believes them. But that just then entails that he has intentional states. And so I have a hard time understanding how we could like attribute knowledge to him in any way if those conditions are not met. That kind of like makes sense to you?
Yeah, so I think like he does have knowledge of proposition. However, his knowledge is immediate. It doesn't follow, like it isn't discursive where like he doesn't say one thing and it leads to another thing. His knowledge is immediate.
Yes, I have a hard time.
And the main reason we say his knowledge isn't propositional is because propositions change, and we don't say that God's mind changes.
I'm not sure what you mean by propositions change. I don't think propositions change. Maybe what you mean is something like truth values of some propositions change. Like, for example, that it's night or that there's a bottle on the table. If I were to move the bottle from the table, that proposition would cease to be true. But is that what you mean by propositions changing, that the truth value might change?
Yeah, as in like you can think about it this way, as in like propositions are like statements about like states of affairs. States of affairs change.
They're not statements. Propositions are just the entities that are truth bearing.
Yeah.
They're expressed by statements. They're not
Yeah.
the statements.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so for some propositions the truth value changes, but there are propositions whose truth value doesn't change. Like, you can take something like the axioms of logic or math as an example, like the law of non-contradiction as an example.
Yeah.
But the point that I was making was something like, I have a hard time understanding how you can attribute knowledge without kind of like attributing belief states to the agent. And belief states are going to be non-identical to each other, like the belief about the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction, for example. But
Yeah.
given that belief states are such, that would entail, non-simplicity in the sense of simplicity that you want it to be. And it seems like the kind of like what's doing the work for you is the mode, but I have a hard time understanding how that mode gives him knowledge. Once we understand knowledge, given the analysis that I gave earlier, as warranted true beliefs, it almost seems like for you, the kind of like knowledge, you're checking that God doesn't have beliefs, but you want to say that he has knowledge, so to speak.
Yeah, as in like God doesn't go from like premise to conclusion. That's all.
Well, that's fine. We can grant that.
Yeah, he's saying it's
the kind of
discursive, I guess.
Yeah, we can grant that the God is
Yeah.
kind of like agent whose warrant of justification is not inferential, or at least he didn't base the kind of like warrant that he had, the kind of like doxastic warrant that he has. He didn't come to it through doing like inferences or something.
Yeah.
That's not what the problem. But that's not what the problem is. The problem lies is, given that beliefs are non-identical to each other, that suffices for there to be non-simplicity.
Oh, simply, yeah, I don't hold
Yeah,
to that.
yeah.
Yeah. So I don't hold to that sense of like absolute simplicity. I believe there's distinctions.
Okay, so I thought Jack said.
You think they're virtual? You think they're just virtual distinctions?
by the way,
and
Jack,
not
I don't really know. I mean,
Sure.
you could say they are.
Before we get into like the Thomistic nomenclature, is that the kind of like critique, Jack, that you had in mind?
Yes.
That I ran now,
Yeah.
or did you want to go some other way?
No. I think that's excellent.
All right. I mean, I don't mind. It just seems hard to conceive of knowledge if it's not belief, and belief suffices for there not to be simplicity. I think that's the way you can think of that critique being run right now.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have this view, which maybe you and I have talked about, which is that theists are kind of like forced to play the gibberish card somewhere. Right? Like, when you start investigating what it is that's being asserted, somewhere or another, something is being appealed to that's really not intelligent.
Right, but I think in the case of divine simplicity, there's like layers and layers of gibberish, and there's like multitudes of points that are gibberish, besides just this one about like.
I agree with that, though. He doesn't hold to the traditional theist form, because he's not actually in the
Yeah, I don't
tradition.
hold to the
He's
virtual
Oriental
distinctions.
Orthodox.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, because like just given these this would be like one worry, and also it would also entail like necessitarianism, which I think is like problematic, and then also other gibberish would be.
Well, maybe you should
taking
talk
the
to him
prop-
about. Maybe you should talk to him about the necessitarian thing. See what view he takes on that.
Are you like familiar with the kind of like how it like entails necessitarianism?
That
Sometimes
God,
called
like,
modal collapse, the view that all propositions are necessary, or necessarily, all propositions that are true are necessarily true.
like
because
so
think
God
about it-
has to fulfill all of that.
Yeah,
But
no,
you know
think
the
about it this
distinction
way.
between
Sorry,
contingency
gotcha.
and necessity, or possibility and necessity?
Yes, if it's possible for God to do something, like He has to do
Like
that.
the idea is that things could have been different, right? Like it could have been that instead of having brown hair, I had blonde hair, right? It could have been that instead of the lamppost being on my street corner, it's across the street. Okay? And so what Venus is trying to say is that there's a worry here that this type of divine simplicity entails that there are no propositions of that kind. Everything that's true could not have been otherwise, could not have been any other way.
So like there's a possible so in all possible worlds.
There's only
that
one
this is-
possible world
Right,
on this
right.
view. The actual world is the only possible world.
No, I don't think hold to that because I believe God is like a free being,
Okay,
so he's
so
not
Venus-
necessary.
And it wouldn't be free as well, and I can walk you through.
But
But
explain
do you
to-
understand
yeah.
why? But do you understand why it entails necessarianism, or should we?
Oh, you need
kind
to
of
explain. You
unpack
need
that
to
first?
explain that.
Yeah. So think about it this way: given that God is omniscient, He knows all true propositions. But given that God is simple, He's going to be identical to His knowledge. And given like the law, Leibniz law, like the law of indiscernibility, if God is identical to His knowledge, then His knowledge is going to be necessary. And because God knows all true propositions are going to be necessary. And that means that there are no contingently true propositions because God knows all propositions. And that means that like all true propositions are necessary. And so that means there are no possible worlds because there are no true propositions which are contingent. And so that's the intent to necessitarianism. And then the problem then is that God can't be a free agent because even if you want to do some kind of like a move of saying that, well, even if necessitarianism is true, you can cash out the idea of doing otherwise, that it's possible to do otherwise, epistemic by like doxastic possibility or epistemic possibility. But the problem is, given that God is omniscient, that's not going to work for God. And so God couldn't have done otherwise by even a weaker modality like epistemic or doxastic modality. And so God wouldn't be a free agent. But presumably you're committed to the thesis that God is a free agent. And so
Yeah, so I think that would be
Did that
like
make-
a yeah. So I think that would be like a perfect argument against the Thomist. But within like the Orthodox framework, we believe that although we do hold to absolute divine simplicity, but almost like in an Eastern sense, where we don't believe God is composed of parts. But in terms of God's like knowledge or will being identical to His essence, we don't believe that. We believe there's a distinction between His essence and
Yes,
we call it
energies distinction.
ED. Yeah. So then, if God's will was identical to His essence, then it would be necessary that He creates in all possible worlds.
Right. So it seems like you don't then hold to absolute divine simplicity, but you hold to something else that you call absolute divine simplicity, but
Yeah. So you might be referring
popularly
to
known as absolute
Aquinas.
divine simplicity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, not just Aquinas, but also like the Avicennian, the Sadrian, the Akbarian, Neoplatonist types, other kinds of like absolute divine simplicity that don't allow for the kind of distinctions that
So what
you're
was the one you
allowed
said
for.
between Sadrian and Neoplatonist? Abdul Qadir? That one?
Akbarian, like
Akbarian.
Ibn Arabi's form of Neoplatonism. That one's popular among some Sunni Muslims.
Yeah, well, can you address the essence energy distinction? Or do you
Into the
not know?
heart, Draco.
To be, I can, but like
No,
if
not
you're
you,
gonna
not
ask
you,
me-
not you. I'm just
Oh,
wondering
okay.
if Venus has. That's energy distinction is not something I've ever really understood well.
I'm not familiar with like Eastern. I'm not familiar or understand the energy essence distinction that well.
They want to say God's essence is distinct from His operations. I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
So just give me 1 second. I just have some background noise. So operations there is cashed out as his actions,
Yeah.
and also his knowledge and will.
Yeah. We call it energies
No.
as well.
Right? Yeah. You're calling the operations for energies. Now, Jack, did you have in mind that the kind of you're not saying, Jack, that the kind of like objections to ADS would apply to this view in which you're making a
Well,
distinction
all I
between.
know is that people in the Eastern Christian tradition will often appeal to the essence energies distinction as a way in which to avoid certain objections that might be forceful against Thomistic views. So maybe there's a way to construe God as being divinely simple, such that given an essence energies distinction, it wouldn't be vulnerable to like the entailment of modal collapse or something like that. I've heard people say that, but I just don't know enough about the view to know how it does that, how it avoids that entailment, and also like whether it makes sense, in itself to have a distinction like this.
Okay, I see what you mean. Because it just strikes me that's sufficient for it not to be absolute divine simplicity. But
Yeah, I agree.
it seems to me, yeah. But presumably they want to say something like, given not his energies, what about like his properties that are not his energies, like are those going to be identical to him, like his omnibenevolence or his, some other things they want to predicate upon God? Because Plantinga has this objection that there's going to be a category error because properties are going to be abstracta, whereas God is going to be a concreta, and thus they're going to have a category error in which like something concrete is going to be identical to something abstract. And I'm kind of curious if that would be applicable to this, even if they're granting that what they're calling the energies is not identical to his essence, that the properties are going to be identical to his essence.
Yeah, well, would you say that God's properties are identical to his essence? Jay?
To be fair, I'm like a layman in EED, so I don't want to
Okay.
comment on anything. But like, there is a distinction. Like, God's foreknowledge isn't like identical to his like will, for example.
So that would probably be one worry. Another worry is like as long as he's having properties, that might suffice for some kind of like composition. But that would be like a lesser worry than the former worry that I just read now. Another worry would also be that like if you take existence to be a predicate, and you take that to be identical to God, that's just going to be gibberish because I don't understand what it would mean to say God is identical to his existence or God is identical to existence. That just appears to me to be nonsensical.
I'm also interested. Do you have like anything like better than the moral argument you already presented, or?
Yeah, I mean, usually this is my argument, to be fair. I use the moral argument.
No.
Was it the abductive version or like the deductive version?
That prescriptions
went
require a prescriber, and the moral facts are absolute, changeless, and universal. Therefore, it would require something that's also unchanging, universal, and absolute.
Oh, that seems to have like a couple of steps that
Yeah.
I thought by moral argument he meant like something like Craig's argument.
No, but you've heard of arguments of this type, right? Where they say they take a kind of prescriptivist view, and then they just understand prescriptions as being the kinds of things that presuppose a prescribing, right? I'm sure you've heard of arguments like that.
No, I heard about it, but those are like almost like precept style arguments.
Oh, I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to see. I want to see how far we could get. Like, could you make a sort of valid version of that, right? Granting the premises,
To be fair, I have like tried pushing it. I mean, I don't know if it's entirely correct, like pushing it towards the Trinity itself or God being interpersonal to an extent.
Well, but you hold to a Trinitarian view, right?
Yeah.
So presumably you think that God consists of three persons or something.
Not necessarily three.
No.
But like if
Okay.
God does grant morality, morality presupposes a relation. So God himself also must be relational.
Yeah, we're in Dungeons and Dragons territory here.
Yeah.
The Trinity. Once you bring in the Trinity, it's like very, very hard for us to understand.
Well, let's try and get our next guest then. Everyone tap, share the screen. We don't got no one in the queue. Tap share the screen.
Are you guys still gonna be on? I just gotta go for like a few minutes.
That guy was good though, Jay. If you're still here, you were a very good guest. Much better than anything that came before today. Today has been an absolute nightmare.